One day, an officer from the German Navy headquarters in Berlin arrived at our base in Kiel with the order to make available one man for Adolf Hitler's personal service. And he should be one of the experienced sailors, and not just one of those who were on land duty, but rather one who had actually served at sea. The reason for this was that Adolf Hitler on one occasion had traveled from Berlin to Dresden to attend an opera. Hitler then realized that he didn't have a dress shirt with him, and so someone had to quickly drive him around to find a new shirt. Goering then suggested to him that he find a manservant who would be solely responsible for his personal belongings, and that it would be best that he take someone from the Navy, as they were the most experienced and versatile men. Goering told Hitler that he himself had such a manservant from the Navy, and that he was very pleased with him. I was only asked, would you be interested? But really, in the military, you just do your duty and you go where you're sent. 3 of us were selected, and we were sent to see General Blomberg. He then took us to meet with Adolf Hitler, and he introduced us. There was one other sailor who had just come into Berlin. I myself had just come in from the Baltic, and another came in from the North Sea. We had to wait there in Berlin for 2 days. Eventually, we were all introduced to Hitler, and then we went up separately to his office for interviews. Finally, it was my turn. I introduced myself, and I was asked a few basic things like, who are you? Do you know why you're here? Do you know what we're looking for? It was all quite routine, and then we were dismissed. Herr Bruckner, who was there, gave each of us 50 marks and told us to go out and see Berlin, and then to report back the next day. We stayed overnight in the barracks at Lichterfelde with Hitler's personal SS regiment, and then we went back the next day, but nothing had been decided yet. Well, 2 days later, I was informed the Fuehrer has decided that he'll take you. They said, Herr Krause, you can now go and collect your personal effects from the base and then report back here. So I went up to Kiel to get my things and then came back to the Reichschancellery. When I arrived, Hitler gave me his hand and he greeted me warmly, saying, "So, you've come to be in my service." And we went outside into the garden. I went to fetch a couple of chairs for us, but he said, "Oh, no, that'll be your job in the future. Today, please allow me." And so he then brought over 2 chairs for us. There were several other people there at the time. Dr. Goebbels, his wife and family, several other ladies, but I don't remember who they all were now. Anyways, he and I went off about 20 or 30 meters away from all of the others. We sat down across from one another in the garden, and we had a short conversation. He asked me about my family, where I come from, what my father does, and things like that. We spoke for a little while, I guess maybe 10 minutes or so. Then we got up, brought the chairs back to the table, and then I left. Now I only had my Navy uniform with me, so Herr Bruckner arranged for me to go see a tailor who made 2 suits for me, one dark and one white. I was then sent to a hospitality trade school located in Munich, because I really had no idea what all of my duties were going to be, particularly with his clothing and so on. And so there I received some professional training. It was actually during the summer holidays, so there was no one else there. And so I received one-on-one training with the instructors there. I would spend an hour or so with one here, then an hour with somebody else, and so on. The director of the school, Herr Krause, would drive me around Munich, and we would go to various establishments where we would be served. Herr Krause would then point out to me all of the various mistakes that the waiters were making. And he would say to me, "You have to do it like this, or from this side, or the other side, when serving dinner or drinks, and so on and so forth." And then one day I was finally called to report to the Fuehrer, even though I had not quite finished my training yet. I was first put to work at Buckeberg at the Harvest Festival. And there I thought, well, I'll just stay in the background for now. But he took me by the arm and showed me where he wanted me to be, and he said, "This is your place over here." Then he told me, "You're also responsible for my security." That didn't really bother me. I suppose I was a bit nervous inwardly, in the way that one gets nervous in any new situation. But as a soldier, basically I thought, it's no big deal. And I thought to myself, well, whatever happens, happens. Basically, I just learned my job on the fly. Later on, when we went to Obersalzberg, it was obvious that I couldn't be there in civilian dress, but I didn't have the right uniform either. My Navy uniform was way out of place up there, so an SS uniform was needed. We went to town in the morning and had one made up and picked it up in the evening. They had it ready the very same day, but they didn't have any black SS boots for me. So they gave me a pair of brown SA boots and had to dye them black for me later. There's still some pictures around from those early days. I think I looked pretty silly. Now, at first I worked alone, but later it became too much for me. I was working from very early in the morning until quite late at night. I didn't get to bed sometimes until 1 or 1:30 in the morning. And for me, that was just too much. Later on, at Obersalzberg, I had to serve his visitors too, and it just became way too much for me. So then, 3 more men were brought in to assist me. Well, first 2, then later another 2. But one of them didn't last very long, and he was sent back. He really wasn't happy there, and he just couldn't do it. So that left the 3 of us. There was Herr Meyer, and of course Herr Linge, who was also with Hitler right up until the very end in Berlin. As for Herr Meyer, however, he returned to his unit, as he had requested, and he was killed in action during the war. I was on vacation at the time, and suddenly I was called back, and I had to go along with him. I was actually with my wife on the island of Hiddensee when he ordered that I should return. He said, "I've brought you back so that you can inform me what this is and what those are, etc., rather than being told by the Navy itself." He said that an officer had tried to tell me this and that, but you've been there as a sailor on these ships, so you can explain things to me much better. So we were on board the ship there for 2 days, and then I was able to go back and enjoy the rest of my vacation. It was exactly like this with me. I wasn't a party member. Everyone, especially the top people, had been telling me that I should join the party, and I thought to myself, well, what should I do? Finally, I said, "My Fuhrer, everyone wants me to join the party. What should I do?" He looked at me and said, "No, you don't need to join the party. You're a soldier. Serve me as a soldier." And then he said, "You know, I may just dissolve the party altogether." Yes, that's what he said. Sorry if I digress here, but Herr Wagner once said, Adolf, and I should add that he and Hitler were on a first-name basis with one another whenever they were together. But of course, just not in public. And it was exactly the same way with us. We simply called him the boss. It was never, "The Fuhrer is doing this or doing that." But of course, when there were strangers or prominent people around, yes, then of course we would refer to him as the Fuhrer. But otherwise, he was just the boss. With the organizers, it was the same thing. That was just normal. It wasn't always the Fuehrer, or Herr Hitler, or whatever. For us, he was just the boss. But back to the topic. Hitler said then, "There are only Germans and no party." He really said that. It was in the city of Bayreuth, when we were with Winifred Wagner, and I was perhaps just 2 or 3 meters away when he said it. Well, of course, get up in the morning and have everything ready. I'd have a uniform hanging for him there. We had one of those things which Professor Todt had designed. Oh, what's it called again? Sort of a stand over which he would hang his jacket or anything that was new. He would let himself in and out of his room, and he undressed by himself in private, into a shirt. He wore a nightshirt, not pajamas. I would make his bed, and the maids would clean everything. And then I would bring him his breakfast. It was already prepared downstairs. I would just bring it up to him and carry it in. I had to fetch it from downstairs because his quarters were on the upper floor in the Reichschancellery. And so there he ate his breakfast. And that consisted of a chocolate bar, some Leibniz cookies, and 2 glasses of warm milk. And I had this thing to keep things warm with, you know. The milk was in a container that would hold about 2 or 2.5 cups. And he ate the Leibniz cookies and some chocolate. He would eat this every day for breakfast? Yes, every morning. Whether in Berlin or Obersalzberg or in Munich, it was the same everywhere. The breakfast was always the same. Leibniz cookies and chocolate. Did he always eat breakfast alone, or were others present? There was no one there. No one. Not even at Obersalzberg or wherever. Not even Eva Braun was there. Never. Me? No, I'm not a vegetarian. But yes, Hitler was. Up until the start of the war, however, he began to eat some sardines. Not so much because he enjoyed them, but because of the fish oil. Perhaps his doctors, Morel or Brandt, had recommended them to him. But otherwise, he was a strict vegetarian. Even when we were entertaining guests, there were vegetarian dishes prepared. But afterwards, they would all sneak into the kitchen, and they would break out the schnitzel. Everyone could eat what they wanted. Even he himself. You know, the kitchen staff would make up a menu of 3 or 4 choices. And I would take these to him when he was having his breakfast, so he could choose what he wanted to eat later on. This, or that. And then he would say, "Okay, I'll have this," or "I'll have that." And I would go to the chef, especially there in Berlin, and I'd tell them, "Today the boss," as I said earlier, we called him the boss, "the boss would like to eat this or that today." And I would be served, whether in Berlin or at Obersalzberg. I would be served my meals separately, while the guests would be served by the staff waiters. Now that was one of the nicest times, when we were at Obersalzberg. Okay, maybe not from the very beginning, because there were so many visitors. Every time, well, actually this one time, one of the ladies who was visiting, they were having coffee together, and I really don't know all of the details. It was really only something I had heard, that one of them had said to Hitler that he ought to get married, and that really made him mad. And so after that, no more women up there. But we had a wonderful time there on Obersalzberg. No women, no stress. It took over a year before he ever said again that anything was wrong. You know, he wasn't snooping around everywhere. The everyday things didn't bother him. Okay, so you couldn't describe him as ungrateful? Never. How was his behavior then? Can you describe him? He was very normal, and like every other person. Only when there were foreigners or guests present, then he was very meticulous. You know what I mean, right? Meticulous. I mean, he was a bit, well, correct? Well, that's not really the word either. What can I say then? Just meticulous. When this bothered him or that bothered him, when the little things weren't in order, that was just not acceptable. He'd usually sleep until noon, and then he would eat lunch, sometimes without eating his breakfast, and then we would go for a nice walk. Usually, we'd walk down to some of the nearby villages and have a cup of coffee. Or once in a while, though not very often, we'd drive up to the Eagle's Nest, the tea house, but very seldom. And why is that? I really don't know. You said that you would often go for walks together. Yes, and mostly alone, but not always. I'd usually walk a few meters behind him, and any others that were there, so I didn't always know what they were discussing. There were others that would go along. There was sometimes another bodyguard for his safety. There were 3 men from the police, and we would go up to Hochlenzer, sometimes down to Schwarzkale. On 2 occasions, we walked all the way to Königssee. Sometimes Mr. Blomberg would come along too, and this one time, everyone else had to stay behind when Blomberg was there. So there was the 3 of us, Herr Hitler, Blomberg, and myself. We didn't want to stand out too much. And we went into the guest lodge called Schiffmeister and had a cup of coffee. Just the 3 of us. Then later, we were joined by the bodyguard and various other guests that had been invited. And nobody even noticed us. It was only when all of the others had joined us that the people became aware of our presence. And then there would be 50 or 100 people standing around, and they would cry that they wanted to see their Fuehrer. And then later, the chauffeurs would come with the cars to pick us up and take us back to Obersalzberg. And so you would just simply walk on into these guest lodges? Yes, right on in, without any notice. Nobody knew that we were coming. But Hitler, he had no fear. He was undemanding. It was really only when foreigners, ladies, or dignitaries were present that he expected that the proper etiquette be maintained. But otherwise, he was easy to please. What were his personal expectations? None. What he did, or what he had built, he did for his people, not for himself. He was an uncomplicated man. That's clear. When others, or how shall I say it, important personalities were present, then he would become almost fearful, not regarding himself, but rather that things could go wrong. It was just his concern that things might not turn out as planned, and he could become worried, almost afraid. His mission was to raise the German people up to the highest level. That was his idea. He wanted things to finally go well for the Germans. In terms of his personal possessions, he had a big iron bed, a closet for clothes, and another for shoes, and that was about it. The one thing I could never really understand is that he would use 2 razor blades every time that he would shave. Well, for me, that's a bit extreme. A razor cuts better the second time than the first. So that's the sort of thing where I had to wonder a little bit and ask, what for, really? But he was really a simple man. The simplest man there ever was. Again, when there were important people, ladies, film stars, etc. present, then he insisted upon etiquette. Then nothing dared go wrong. When we got into the car, and he would sit down, and he would be wearing his long overcoat, I would grab his collar from behind him, and I would pull him up, and then he could settle himself in. And he would say sometimes along the way, "Remember this when you write your memoirs, how you would grab me by the collar and pull me up." And with that, I just want to demonstrate how simple he was to deal with. One time he said to me, and this was in the early days, "Herr Krause, when are you ever going to go out?" And I said, "Well, when the Fuehrer goes to bed." "Oh," he said, with a laugh, "well, then I'll have to ring for a very long time." You see, there was this box, and this thing would drop down to notify me when the Fuehrer had rang. "Well," he said, "just remember then, when you go out, that there are 2 types of women." And then he stopped and said, "Oh, wait a minute. You're a Navy man." And he put his finger to his head like this, and he said, "You're an experienced sailor, so you would know all the tricks." And with that, again, I just want to demonstrate how easygoing he was with things. He loved children. That's clear. That could never be feigned. Even the historians acknowledge that much. It was not feigned. His main concern was, he wanted to ensure that nothing would ever befall his people again. He took it upon himself, and he said, "Never again." Earlier, in the First World War, he was a message carrier. And so he had to run across the front lines, often through a hail of bullets. And you have to realize that, in those situations, one totally loses touch with the feeling of fear. If anyone had wanted to, it would have been easy to assassinate him. But when something was really bothering him, he became quiet. And he would spend many hours alone, just gone, until he had, in some way, come to terms with the issue that was on his mind. He would spend a lot of time reading. Every week, he would read every illustrated magazine that was available in Germany, or at very least, flip through them. I would also buy books for him. Anytime I saw a new book that I thought would be of interest to him, I would buy it and give it to him. And this one time, he really amazed me. It was evening, and there were perhaps 12 or 15 people at the table having dinner. And he started to talk about this new book he had been reading. And he said, "I've read this book, and it says that." And I thought to myself, that's impossible. I just gave him that book yesterday. He could not have finished reading that book already. And then he said to me, "Please go up and get the book for me. It's on my nightstand." So I bring it down, and he says to open it to a certain page number and to read it. And so I opened it and began to read it aloud. And then I thought to myself, he could not have read this book in a single night. It would have taken me a few full days to read it, and he didn't even spend all night with it. I was just dumbfounded. How on earth did he do that? I mean, he had so many other things on his mind to deal with. But he had already memorized many things from this same book. I was just stunned. I was really amazed, too, when we would get on board a plane, how he would notice right away if one of the engines wasn't running exactly the same as the others. And he would say to me, "Please go ask them about it." Other times, when we were out riding in the car, if a spark plug might be misfiring, he sensed it at once. There was this one time at Christmas. We wrapped a bunch of presents for all of his special friends. Something for this one, for that one, and the other one. And at the end he said, "Now please order us a taxi." I was floored. He said, "You don't need to change, just put on an overcoat." I thought, what's going on? I said to him, "But the chauffeur is downstairs." And he said, "Oh, no. He can take the car and go home now." So we just got into the cab and drove off from the rear exit, which was used for deliveries and such. He took his keys and he locked up behind us. I thought, well, I should probably sit up front next to the driver. But he took my arm and pulled me to the rear door. So then I got in the back with him. Then he started telling the driver, "Go here, go there, go there, go here." I think the driver thought to himself, well, here's a couple of strange ones. Then suddenly he told the driver, "Go to Café Luitpold." I thought to myself, oh my goodness, here I am alone with him, and we're going to Café Luitpold? And it's probably closing time over there. The driver, well, I was to pay him with a 50-mark note, and I did expect to get some change back. But Hitler said no, let him keep it. I think I had not quite closed the door, and the taxi took off quickly. The door slammed shut, and he was gone. He was probably thinking, thank God I'm rid of them. And then we went for a walk to Marienplatz. As per usual, I started to walk a meter or so behind him, like I always do. But he said, "No, come here on my side. Nobody will believe that I'm actually walking around here in Munich." It was around 11 or 11:30 at night. Whenever someone would approach us from the opposite direction, he just grabbed his hat and pulled it down a bit, and kept his head tilted forward so that no one would recognize him. It was very icy, so we locked arms just to support ourselves, because it was terribly slippery. Then finally we came to Polsientenplatz, where his apartment was, when suddenly we heard, "Halt!" There was police across the way patrolling, and there was one of his guards in the doorway from the Waffen-SS, and a couple of police officers patrolling up and down the street. And we were about to cross the street, and one calls out, "Halt! Verboten!" So Hitler stopped and waited, and I went ahead and approached them. As the man recognized me, he firmly clicked his heels together and saluted. I remember it well, even now. And then we went ahead and continued on inside the apartment. But once inside, I received some harsh words from Himmler and the others, because I hadn't reported in that I was going out alone with him in the city. But Hitler, he was never scared. He just wanted to go out and see old Munich again, alone, without being bothered, without anyone following him around. He just wanted to go alone. He would look around here and there, in this window or that one, just to see what's going on, and to see some of his favorite places again, from the old days. And he was never scared. Even in Poland, when we visited the front lines, we went to inspect some of the graves there, and he would walk around openly, with me following him as usual. Keitel and the others were just beside themselves. I mean, we were not more than 100 meters away from the front line during the war in Poland. Well, what can I say? I didn't like her, and she didn't like me either. Why not? Well, put it this way. Most people would say to her, "Dear lady," "Gracious lady," and things like that. And I just couldn't bring myself to say it. I mean, gracious? Who's gracious? God only, perhaps. And she took it as an insult, I suppose. At first she was there more or less on her own. But later, Frau Brandt or Frau Morell would come by, or Frau Bormann, although she was there less often. And later there would be film stars who were invited too, and so she was more or less always with them. Otherwise, we had a fairly normal, cordial, friendly relationship. As to how she and Hitler were together, privately, well, the door was locked and I never went in, so I couldn't say. Now that was overwhelming, and there was no use of force. We just headed straight down there that day, and nobody knew we were coming. It was only when we got to the border that it became widely known that Hitler was in Austria and was en route to Vienna, and the word spread fast, faster perhaps than by radio or TV. And how did the people react? Oh my goodness. They were screaming. This high-pitched screaming. At dinner, I was exhausted, and I fell asleep. I could still only hear this screaming in my ears. They were so excited. My duties there were primarily for security. But honestly, I hardly saw him, even though he was right in front of me. I saw nothing. I was just looking into the crowd to see what was going on. Hitler said, "My fellow Austrians, now I have brought you into the Reich." And he was totally excited. He was happy, joyful, and just thrilled that everything went so smoothly. We rented the entire hotel there where we stayed, and there was this little episode. The bill came, and I don't recall how big it was now. And Hitler had given me some money to pay for various things, but Herr Bruckner paid for most of it. Bruckner said, "The bill is way too high." Hitler said, "Maybe they've got many debts too. Just pay it." It was the night with the synagogues. I remember it very well, as they were set ablaze, back then on the 9th of November. Herr Schaub came in and he said, "The synagogues are burning all over Germany." Hitler knew absolutely nothing about it. He suddenly became pale as a ghost, and he said, "What the hell have they done? I will get the blame for this." That was his expression, truly from him, his words directly. Herr Schaub began to say something, and Dr. Goebbels too. "I don't care," said Hitler. And he got up, and we all went out, got into the car, and drove through Munich. And then we sat there in the car, nearby where one of the synagogues was on fire. Then we went into his apartment on Prinzregentenstrasse. I let them in and locked up, and then I was dismissed. But he opened the door one more time to say that he wanted to be woken up early in the morning at a certain time. He was totally outraged about the situation. Totally incensed. I'll repeat it. He said, "What have they done? I will be blamed for this." Herr Schaub remembered it that way as well, and Dr. Goebbels too. What more can I say? We jumped in the car, nothing was said. We drove around Munich, and we looked around. In that area, not far from where he lived, though just briefly. Then we went to his place, we went to his room, and I was dismissed until it was time to wake him in the morning. He raised his hand, and he slapped it down on his knee, and he said, "It's done. Really. It's done." That they had come to an understanding, and with it, he had achieved security that would cover Germany's back. The generals had all gathered there on that day, and Hitler waited until each had departed, going out their own way, some through the front, some through the garden, the same way that they had arrived together. He sat there, not far from me, at the window, about as far away as that window there, and I stood nearby. He said, "No one comes through here now," because there was another entrance nearby from the kitchen. And he sat there in his chair and was reflecting on everything. And then one army division, the Deutschland troop, went out and marched down Fliegenstrasse. Finally, Hitler stood up and declared, "It has begun. The ball is now rolling. Even I can't stop it now. God willing, it will have a good outcome." Then he left the room and went down the stairs to the library, and he closed the door. No one could go in. Only the next morning. Then he rang for me. He had not even told me if or when he wanted to be woken up. So I had to just wait, watch the bell, and be ready, and then I went in. I personally understood it this way, that it was the Wehrmacht that really wanted to go into Poland, and not him. So you mean to say that it was the general staff that really wanted to attack Poland, and not him? The generals wanted it. But he was for it too. Yes, sure. But it's like this. You have 100 men under you, and you're the boss. And when they don't want to go along with you, what do? Either you go along with them, or the company falls apart and goes broke. That's really the way you have to look at it to understand it. Maybe I'm a bit too old for it all now, to understand everything that happened, especially when, in the last 50 years or so, I've not really given any thought to any of these things. I only remember how Herr von Ribbentrop said to the Englishman, "Come to your senses, man." Now I can't recall the exact words which followed, but he said, basically, there is no reason to start a war regarding Poland. And then suddenly, Mr. Eden ran down the stairs, and I remember how he said, if I had stayed up there another 15 minutes with them, I probably would have been in agreement with them, the Germans, and that's just not permitted. Hitler wanted, especially, to be on good terms with England, and if possible, also with the French. He always said that the Germans and the French had the very best soldiers, but that no one could control colonies like England did. He really said that. And they can, with just one hand, control millions of people. We can't. We don't have the people for that. They, the English, know how to do that. And afterwards he said, the best soldiers will have to go with the worst soldiers. And he meant, of course, the Italians. And he said, at one time they had the Romans, but they don't have any Romans now. We did an inspection tour on the front lines in Poland, and that's when he and I got into an argument over a bottle of his favorite mineral water. It wasn't there, and I was blamed for it, although it really was not my fault, but rather the whole crew. In every car, there were bottles of this mineral water. When they sat down to lunch, he wanted a bottle of the mineral water, and there was none there. I went to the doctor and I said, look, we're all drinking from this spring water. He checked it out and he said, yes, so what? And I said, well, the boss claims that I forgot his water, and I wanted to, well, but then the others suddenly began to claim that I had tried to poison the boss, and all such nonsense. I was sent to Berlin. I was dismissed. But I think he was just looking for someone to let his frustration out on. And whenever that occurred, it was usually me that was the lightning rod. And the real reason for his anger was this. From his personal SS Guard unit, I had assembled a small troop of 25 men to arrive there in advance. And they got ambushed. And they were all killed. They were found lying in a fruit grove. Their bodies were mutilated, their genitals cut out, their tongues cut out, and their eyes gouged out. He was furious, and that happened right there on that very same day. And of course he was furious, and I wore it. I was sent to Berlin, and for 3 months I really didn't do anything there. I was supposed to go to Tannenberg, Hitler's quarters in the Black Forest. The superintendent of the chancellery came to see me, and he said, well, he said this and that, and he saw to it that I had everything that I needed. But he thought that I should continue to work there with Hitler. I said, no, I have already served the Fuehrer. I want to go back to my troop. Nope, he said, I can't help you with that. And so I continued to wait. And it was about a quarter of a year by then. I continued to receive my salary, but I had nothing to do. And then one fine day, as the Fuehrer once again returned to Berlin, I waited for him. I knew at what time he would usually go to bed, and so I went upstairs, and I waited for him by the door. He looked at me and he blurted out, "What's the matter?" in sort of a half-angry tone. "What is it?" I said, "My Fuehrer, I'm stuck now here in Berlin. I want to report back to my troop." He left me standing there, and he went into his room. Then he opened the door again and said, "To which troop do you want to go? To my SS Guard unit? You really can't do any better than that." I said, "My Fuhrer, I come from the Navy and I want to return to the Navy." He said, "All right then, tell Herr Puttkamer to come upstairs." Herr Puttkamer came up and went inside. Then he returned and said, "The Fuhrer has decided that you are now free to return to the Navy, and that I should ensure that you receive an appropriate posting." He asked, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "Well, to the U-boat service, of course. That was the big thing those days, the U-boats." And so then I departed for Kiel. Within 3 days I had my orders, and I was to report for the U-boat service. But when I got there, I was told, "Sorry, but for that you need special training," as it was really very technical. And all of that takes time to learn, you know? So we'll send you on a destroyer instead. I thought to myself, this guy's a real smooth talker. And then he said, "I know you, and I know what you really want and why. When you return, you want to have a big story to tell to the Fuhrer about us here in the Navy." So then, off I went from Kiel to Wilhelmshaven, which we in the Navy call Schlichtau, and I reported for duty. But they didn't even want to take me. However, I had this letter in my hand from the Fuhrer, and I showed it to them. And so they grabbed my suitcase, and in I went. And then suddenly, I was a somebody again. Until then, I was a nobody, and they didn't even want to take me on their ship. But they had to allow me. And so we sailed for Narvik. I was actually sunk 3 times while in the Navy. Later, when I returned to Berlin, Hitler greeted me again, and he said, "I had to bring you back. You were on 3 ships, and all 3 went to the bottom. And if I allowed you to continue, our Navy would soon run out of ships." Of course he was joking, but he said that. All of the ships that you get on seem to go to the bottom. Don't believe for a minute that he was told everything that was going on, not even during the war. I can tell you of one episode of a situation briefing at the Wolf's Lair. All of the generals were there for a meeting, and then they stepped outside. I glanced at my watch, and then I realized, oh my, it's almost time to eat lunch. So I quickly went to the kitchen to see how lunch was coming along, and everything seemed good. Then, when I came back out, I realized that all of the generals were standing outside talking. Now there was sort of a barracks on the one side, then the hall, and on the other side there were various rooms. The situation room was near the front. As the generals were standing outside, I overheard them say, "He can tell us whatever he wants, but we'll just do what we think is right." The boss actually couldn't trust any of them. And he didn't. Herr Goebbels perhaps. And otherwise Herr Keitel. He was his master's servant and nothing else. The best was Jodl. He was a brilliant strategist. To this day I believe that they would have respected Adolf Hitler far more if he had been of a higher rank and had not just been a corporal in the First World War. Through the various conversations that I was privy to, it had become apparent that the Russians had plans to attack us, and that this was really not too far off. An attack seemed imminent, and so our generals said, "We will have to attack them first." Martin Bormann? In a way, he was the boss of Obersalzberg. He even wanted to have an ID card made up for Adolf Hitler, in order that he may be permitted to come up there. That's how he was up there. He ran everything. I would almost say, and this is my personal opinion, of course, but Bormann, Himmler, and all of those were in a certain way responsible for the many graves of the Third Reich. Hitler wanted the best for the German people, but he wasn't able to achieve it. And that frustrated him, if you know what I mean. It really tormented him inside, and that, more than anything else, is what led to his eventual demise.